Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes to sign on and then get going with our webinar in a few. Thanks for holding tight. Okay, we're a few minutes past the hour, so we're going to get started. And if anyone else trickles in, they can join us then. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jessie Lavallee-Whiffen, and I work for Ducks Unlimited Canada's National Boreal Program. Today, joining me to present our field guide, which I actually, oh, no, there he is. I thought Jamie's internet jumped off there again. I also have James Kenyon, who I'll allow to introduce himself here quickly before I jump into some housekeeping.
Thanks, Jessie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jamie Kenyon. I'm the head of Yukon and Northwest Territories operations for Ducks Unlimited Canada, based in Whitehorse, Yukon.
So today we're going to be giving an overview and an introduction to the Yukon Wetland Field Guide, which we have been working on for a few years now, developing and published this summer. Just as a note, this presentation will be recorded and will be published after the presentation today. As an additional note, if you have any questions throughout our presentation, we will have time for questions at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. And at the end of our presentation, we will start answering some of those. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie, and he's going to get our webinar going.
Thanks. Yeah, as Jessie said, we're very proud and pleased to have released this summer our Yukon Wetland Field Guide. It's been a couple years in the making, and we're very hopeful that it'll be a useful tool for all of you. Next slide, please. I just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. As I said, I'm in Whitehorse on the traditional territories of the Tonquachon Council and Kwanlundun First Nation. Our field guide, covers the entire Yukon, where we have 14 First Nations and the Inuvialuit, who've lived here since time immemorial. They have traveled and cared for these lands for generations. Fishing, hunting, trapping, gathering, performing ceremonies. There's been this connection that Indigenous peoples have forged to the land and its resources, and that's continues today and is vitally important. So just to give an overview of what we'll chat about this afternoon, we'll provide a bit of an introduction to the wetland field guide, talk about the classification system that has been developed and that is used in the guide. Then we'll talk a bit about some of the, I guess you might want to call it value-added sections of the guide, some extra information that we believe people will find helpful. And finally, we'll be able to take your questions and have a bit of a discussion about the guide. Next, please. So the Yukon Wetland Field Guide, we've aimed to make a guide that's very user-friendly. Our audience is a broad range of people, sort of aiming at people who don't necessarily have a background in ecology. So people who may not have, say a bachelor's degree in science, but are more practitioners out on the land. Our guide is vegetation based. We find that that's one of the more easy components for people to look at who aren't as familiar with wetlands as some of us are. One of the unique aspects of this, and Jessie will talk more detail about it later, is that we worked with 8 Yukon elders to include that Indigenous or traditional knowledge within the field guide to try to provide both ways of knowing and provide the user with a little bit more understanding of not only what is a wetland and how do I determine what it is, but also that why are wetlands important and provide that different perspective. Next slide. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Ducks Unlimited Canada, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background to who we are. So we've been around since 1938. We conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and other habitats for North America's waterfowl. And these habitats also have a lot of benefit for other wildlife as well as people. We're part of the National Boreal Program within Ducks Unlimited. We've been around for over 20 years now, and the way we work is a lot of partnerships. We work with governments, Indigenous peoples, industry, and we are science-based. We try to find these comprehensive science-based solutions to conserve boreal wetlands. Some of the objectives that we have that kind of guided the development of this guide is raising awareness and understanding of boreal wetlands and waterfowl. We find that there's a bit of a information gap out there, so we try to get that information into as many people's hands as possible. We collaborate to address conservation challenges. We know that really no entity can do this on their own. We have to work together. And as part of that, we develop a community of practice to share information about wetlands and waterfowl. Next slide, please. So why did we develop this field guide? So as many of you may know, Yukon government recently, about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, announced their policy for the stewardship of Yukon's wetlands. And this is a way to help implement that policy. Obviously, if people need to follow the policy, they need to know whether or not they're in a wetland. We worked with Yukon government to make sure that this guide aligned with the Yukon wetland classification standards and criteria that they've been working on and are hopeful to release in the near future. Excuse me. Identification of Yukon wetlands isn't always straightforward. There's a lot of diversity within Yukon wetlands, and they're not always obvious which ones might be wetlands. So as you can see in that picture on the top, we have a wetland that most people would probably be fairly confident in saying, oh yeah, that's a wetland. You can see a nice little pond there, some marsh alongside of it. These are areas that you're going to want to wear rubber boots, probably hip waders or chest waders, or even go out in a canoe in. What's not as obvious, though, is that bottom photo. That, too, is a wetland. Most of the wetlands in the Yukon are going to be covered in trees or shrubs. These are areas that at most times of the year, in the summer, you can walk through in just a pair of hiking boots and not worry about getting your feet wet as the water is just below the surface. So with thinking of this diversity of areas that look like forests to open ponds, that needed to get out. We've seen it numerous times in applications before the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board, where a proponent of a project will say, how can there be wetlands there? There's no place for a duck to land. Or how can it be a wetland? It's on a hill. So this guide will attempt to answer some of those questions and provide that knowledge to folks that actually, yeah, those are wetlands and they're a bit unique here. As well, we just wanted to increase that understanding of the importance of wetlands and that value. We think that'll also help folks who are looking at working in wetlands sort of understand that, why is it people care? Why is there that little bit of pushback about the activity I want to do here, and how do I mitigate my impact so that these values that other people have are able to remain on the landscape? Next one, please. So yeah, project timeline. We are in year 3 of a 3-year project. Initially, we started by talking to a lot of people. Back, what year would that be? Nice, in 2021 or 2022. Just trying to see what the audience, who they might be, what they would need from a field guide. Then once we had that, we're able to start sort of drafting what the guide might look like, working on the classification scheme, and then worked a lot on getting pictures. As you'll see if you've had a chance to look at the guide, it is very visual. We've tried to put in as many photos as possible and diagrams. So we did a little bit of work to test out the classification scheme as well as get photos. Again, a bit more talking with different members of our audience. Is this working for you? What suggestions do you have for improvement? And then that resulted in the guide being released this July. And now at this point, it's just a matter of getting this guide into as many people's hands as possible and providing this type of training as to how to use the guide and what it can do for you. Next slide, please, Jessie. Is this where you wanted to take over?
Yeah, sure. I can take over from here and kind of start talking about the contents of our field guide and where all of the information base kind of came from. So in the policy for the stewardship of Yukon's wetlands, the Yukon government has defined wetlands as areas that typically have water at or near the ground surface during some or all of the year. These areas can be considered wetland if the water is present long enough for poorly drained soils to form and for water-loving plants to become the dominant type of plant in that area. There are 5 classes of wetlands: bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, shallow open waters. So I'm going to break down this definition a little bit, just to dive a little bit deeper into what is a wetland based on this definition, and to kind of give some insight for why we designed the guide the way we did. So the first part relates to water-loving vegetation. Wetlands are defined as these areas where plants want to grow in water, they thrive growing in water, they have lots of mosses often in Yukon wetlands. So the picture I have here is of sphagnum mosses. These mosses are mostly water. This is where they thrive. You'll also get stunted vegetation that can tolerate wet areas. So oftentimes we see trees like black spruce in wetlands. There are other tree species that will grow into wetlands, but these are our typical, are kind of like keystone black spruce wetland tree. And then other plants like cranberries will also grow in wetlands and are kind of those, when you think of where you're going to find cranberries, you're going to go to a wetland. The second part of classifying a wetland has to do with the soil indicators, which heavily leads into why some of these plants grow where they grow. So soil characteristics will develop over the long term, and they're pretty generally stable wetland indicators. Plants can change over time as wetlands have different successional paths or they're disturbed, but typically your soils are going to be that stable. If you're looking at your soils and finding indicators, they're going to be your good old trusty, yes, this is a wetland. So these soil indicators will include presence of organic soils in wetlands in the Yukon, but also mineral soils. My slide didn't want to advance there for a second. So you're going to find both types of soils in wetlands, and these soils will also lead into what type and class of wetland you're going to be working in. One important note and indicator of soils in wetlands that we often look for is in that mineral layer. Often these will be found under organic soils in those more organic wetlands, which I'll go into and define a little bit in my next slides. But as you can see in the two pictures that I have up on the screen, you get these redox features, which are essentially when mineral soils are saturated or are underwater for prolonged periods. These like laying features, which is that picture on the left where it's really gray, you're going to get blue-gray streaks will be present, or when there's oxygen available in the soil, so the water table's lower, you're getting these orange, iron-rich indicators. So these are really good indicators that, yes, I'm in a wetland, and depending on other features, we can then decide what type of wetland it is. So the last part of this definition is that there's 5 classes of wetlands. So now that we know that there's going to be water in them, they're going to have soil characteristics for defining what type of wetland it is, and they're going to have these water-loving plants, we can break our wetlands down into 2 categories. So we have our organic soil wetlands, or our peatlands, and we have our mineral soil wetlands. So our first class is our peatlands, group, which consists of 2 classes of fens and bogs. So these are going to be wetlands. What Jamie was talking about earlier about sometimes we don't always look at a wetland and know it's a wetland because, well, there's no open water for a duck to land in. That's what these 2 wetlands are kind of getting at. They're going to have organic soil layers that are more than 30 centimeters deep. So when you're looking at those 2 different types of soils, this will be the soil when you dig down that you encounter for at least 30 centimeters. One note is that nationally, when we define peatlands, we usually use a 40 centimeter cutoff for peat depths, but in the Yukon, because of, it's colder, it's further north, things don't grow as fast, things don't develop as fast because of, permafrost and just the climate. You're going to have these more shallower peat deposits, so we rely on the 30 centimeter peat depth in the Yukon. And how do these 2 wetlands differ? Well, fens are typically hydrologically connected on the landscape. You're often going to find them in complexes with swamps and marshes. They move a lot of water across the landscape. So although when you walk into a fen, it might not look like water is flowing, it is. This also results in there being a lot of nutrients for plants, and you're going to find a lot of plant diversity in fen systems typically. Whereas on the other hand, bogs, sometimes from an untrained eye, may look similar, but they're not actually connected, or they're not actually connected hydrologically on the landscape like a fen is. The way that they develop, often when the peat accumulates, it raises up the wetland into a dome, and it actually cuts off and is its own little system. And it's only receiving water from atmospheric inputs. So where fens might have, streams flowing through them or be connected to these other wetlands, bogs are typically isolated, so they're a lot more nutrient poor when we're comparing them to fens, which means they're not going to have as much plant diversity as our fens might. Then our other three classes are our mineral soiled wetlands, which are swamps, marshes, and shallow open waters. So swamps can sometimes look like fens, except they're going to have bigger trees. The water tables are going to be more dynamic, so it's going to account for more growth. And they're going to have less than 30 centimeters of peat. Sometimes a swamp might have a little bit more peat than that, but typically they're going to have an organic deposit that's less than 30 centimeters deep. Then we have our kind of two classic wetlands that we all think of when we think of wetlands, which is our marshes and our shallow open waters. They are pretty dynamic. They'll have open water bodies. At some times in the year, they might look like mud flats because there's not very much water in them. And they're both distinguished by marshes having a lot more of that like emergent vegetation like you see in that picture, whereas a shallow open water body is going to be kind of look like a pond that's less than 2 meters deep and will grow vegetation all the way through the wetland. And these are typically found on like the banks and shorelines of larger lakes or connected with marshes too. So with that, it's really important to note that all of these wetlands can exist within complexes, so they often don't exist alone on the landscape, and that like fen to swamp to marsh wetland complex is really common. In an area where we've done some work, fens and swamps make up almost 97% of wetland types in the Dawson region. So our bogs, our marshes, and our shallow open waters are a little bit more rare, but these fens and swamp complexes are, in our experiences in the work that we've done in the Yukon, are some of the more prominent wetland types that we encounter. So another difference for me specifically coming to the Yukon to do this work was that Yukon wetlands have permafrost, and permafrost heavily impacts wetland formation and wetland types and how we classify wetlands in the Yukon. So it's really important when we're classifying wetlands to look at the impact that they might have. So the further north you go, you might have more stunted growth in wetlands. So, you have smaller active layers, though you don't have to go as deep to find permafrost. And in the southern parts where permafrost is more discontinuous or sporadic, you might have deeper active layers. It allows vegetation to grow more. And for also your organic soils will tend to be deeper. As Jamie kind of alluded to as well, permafrost has done this cool thing in a lot of like the Beringia areas of the Yukon, where we're actually finding wetlands like swamps and bogs up on hillsides because of the way that permafrost has impacted the flow of water in these areas. It's held the water up on these hillsides, and now we're getting, bogs that are living on the sides of mountains rather than in valley bottoms where we would typically think that wetlands are going to be. But with this, and another consideration we had to take into account in developing this guide is that while a shrubby swamp or a shrubby fen in the southern part of the Yukon might have, willows that are a meter tall and it's a shrubby fen, in northern parts of the Yukon, those shrubs could only be less than half a meter or even like 10 centimeters tall, but they're still getting similar wetland classifications under the classification system. So next I'm going to talk about our classification system, and I'm going to briefly go through the different wetland classes. These all align with the Yukon government's wetland classification standards and criteria. So in developing our classification system, we host a vegetation-based wetland classification decision key. So the reason that we go for a vegetation-based classification key is because when people go into a wetland, the first thing that they're going to see typically is vegetation. Like I was talking about earlier, our soils are super, super handy of being a really good telltale of whether or not you're in a wetland, but we're not all going into a wetland with an auger or a shovel and wanting to dig it up to see what's going on in the soils. So our classification key brings us down to the wetland types that you see here. So we have treed, shrubby, and graminoid fens, treed, shrubby, and open bogs, treed and shrubby swamps, marshes, and shallow open water. So the first type of wetlands, and there are three types, are bogs. So again, these are hydrologically disconnected wetlands. They're characterized by hummocky microtopography. So you're going to get these like big mounds of sphagnum mosses typically. They're going to have greater than 30 centimeters of organic soils. And our water table is quite stable in a bog. So that elevation of water table is usually within 30 to 40 centimeters of the ground surface. But because of the sphagnum mosses and how those mosses work, you still get wet surface conditions because of the pulling actions that sphagnum mosses have with water. So bogs can move quite a bit of water through the landscape, but it's typically when during wet periods and water kind of spills out of these wetlands. So we typically say that these are stagnant on the landscape. For our vegetation, it's typically dominated by black spruce that are less than 10 meters tall. So if you're ever driving down the highway and you see all these little baby trees, it's probably going to be some sort of peatland. There's also lots of shrubs like Labrador tea and leatherleaf and bog cranberry. And some bogs can be drier. So our treed bogs in particular, our treed systems are usually our driest form of our wetlands, where when they get dry like that, they're going to start getting covered in lichens and different types of feather mosses as well. But yeah, so there on the screen, you can see our three different types of wetlands and their page correlations. So if you have the guide handy or I'll put up the link at the end for where you can download a free version. You can jump into the guide and dig a little bit deeper into those different types. But yeah, our treed bogs are generally, we have more than 10% tree cover and those small little trees. Our shrubby bogs, we're going to have less than 10% tree cover that are still stunted, but we're going to have a lot more shrubs and they're going to be less than 1 meter tall. And then our open bogs, you're not going to really have that many trees, maybe like a scattered one, not that many shrubs. If you do, they're going to be under that 1 meter tall still. You won't find very many of them. And you typically will have sphagnum mosses and different types of cotton grasses kind of dominating that area. Our next type is our fens. So these guys also have quite hummocky microtopography. You can get tussocks in them. If you've ever walked through a fen or a bog or even a swamp, you know they're probably not the nicest to walk through all the time. Again, these guys are going to have more than 30 centimeters of peat present. And these are going to be our really rich and diverse vegetation-wise peatland compared to a bog because they have groundwater input. Sometimes there's streams moving through them. They're going to be more connected on the landscape. So they're going to be able to host a greater amount of vegetation. And with more of that diversity, you're going to get black spruce. You also might find tamarack trees. In some places in the Yukon, you might even find white spruce in fens. And you're going to get a lot of that bog birch and willow cover in these systems as well. Another really good indicator of fens is going to be buckbean. They really like fen systems, along with different species like sedges and marsh cinquefoil, Solomon seals. You're also going to get more diversity in mosses too, so you're going to get into those brown mosses rather than only sphagnum mosses. So we have our treed fens, which is really similar to our treed bogs. You have more than 10% trees. You have shrubs and willows, Labrador tea, sedges, some cotton grass. Your shrubby fens are going to have less than 10% trees and more than 20% shrub cover, those, shrub birch, willows, lab teas. And then when you get into a graminoid fen, they're going to be kind of similar to your open bog, where we have sphagnum mosses and different types of graminoid species like our buck beans and our marsh cinquefoils. Now to jump over to our mineral wetlands, we have our swamps. So swamps are considered to be a mineral wetland because they have less than 30 centimeters of peat, and you're going to find pretty distinct mottling or glaying once you get past that peat layer and into that mineral layer. There are, like I said before, there are peatland swamps, but they're generally rare and they will have more than 30 centimeters of organic soils or that peat. But this often happens more in transitional areas where you might be transitioning from a fen to a swamp or a swamp to a fen. Like fens, swamps are going to have a variety of inputs of water. Their water tables are going to fluctuate, which is why we get larger and taller trees in swamps. So that treed swamp, it has more than 10% cover. The canopy is going to be denser in a swamp compared to a fen. And the canopy is going to be taller in a fen system too. So when you're walking through, if you have these really little trees, it's really broken up and open, might be a fen. Whereas if you have more of a closed canopy, the trees are pretty tall, you're likely going to be in a more of a swamp environment. And moss cover won't be as consistent in swamps either. It will kind of depend on how dense that canopy is. Where there's sunlight, you might get more mosses, but you're going to have more of that scattered moss cover compared to our peatland systems. Then lastly, we have our shrubby swamps. So these guys, similar to our bogs and fens, have greater than 20% shrub cover, but the shrubs will likely be taller in a swamp system. So in the southern parts of the Yukon, they can be greater than 2 meters tall and tower over you. But again, when you're in our northern systems, they might be a little bit more stunted just because of the impacts of going north. Swamps are also found on the sides of drainage and riparian areas. So sometimes it might be hard to distinguish, am I in a riparian area or am I in a swamp? But we definitely would refer you to the Yukon government's ecosite classification guide if you get into a situation where you're like, I'm not quite sure which one this is. And I'll zoom through these two because, like I was saying, these are kind of a little bit more rare in the Yukon and a little bit more easily distinguishable compared to some of our peatlands and our swamps. But we also have marshes, so very little organic buildup. There is some organic buildup, but it's going to be less than that 30 centimeters again, laying and mottling. You're going to have dominant herbaceous plants, so sedges, grasses, rushes, and reeds. They're often going to be emerging from standing water. They like to be in the water. You're going to have pretty minimal tree cover, less than 10% and less than 20% on those shrubs. And you're going to have less than 75% open water in a marsh. So when we had those pictures earlier, those big open water areas can sometimes get classified as shallow open waters. But if you're lumping a whole system together and you have less than 75% open water, then you're going to typically end up that you're in a marsh system. And then last are our shallow open waters. Marshes and shallow open waters are commonly found together. You're going to have those emergent plants along the edges, but the key distinction between a shallow open water and a larger system like a pond or a lake is that it's going to be less than 2 meters deep, because after that point, this aquatic vegetation that you'll find in wetlands the water's too deep for it to be able to penetrate and, reach the soil and actually grow. So then you're going to get more into those lake and pond systems. So to support some of the work in this, because it's a vegetation-based classification system, we also have a vegetation section in the field guide that goes through common species that you'll find in Yukon wetlands. We also have guides to terminology throughout the guide. So if we're describing a plant, we also have illustrations and definitions to help users identify the wetland vegetation that they're seeing in front of them. We also, throughout the guide, have tools that will help with classification of different types of plants. We use these big terms, and I've done it throughout this presentation as well, where we talk about sphagnum mosses versus feather mosses or brown mosses, and we ask users to use those distinctions to help them achieve a wetland classification. So what we've also done is broken down some of the terminology that we use, like a hummock or a tussock or these mosses, to help users identify them better in the field and understand a little bit more of what they might be looking at. So as Jamie alluded to, I'm going to talk about kind of our other part of this guide beyond just our classification and identification system. So one of our goals in developing this guide was to not only, give a technical perspective on wetlands and their classification and their function, but also integrate more human and cumulative effect values into the guide. So one way that we did this was working with Joe Copperjack, who was our consultant on this guide and helped facilitate a lot of the engagement that we did for the development of the guide, who implemented the land and people's relationship model to help us work with elders to talk about wetlands and understand what's important for them for wetlands. So we do have the full model, including the respect, care, share principles and some of the laws and values of those principles and engagement with elders and on the land in our guide in Appendix 1, along with in the traditional knowledge section of the guide. So I'd really encourage you to go and take a look if you're interested in that model to learn more about it. But as one of the outcomes of working within this model with Copper and our 8 elders from across all of the nations, we worked really hard to weave and balance the traditional knowledge that we were gifted and we were allowed to share with some of the more technical knowledge. So throughout the guide, you're going to see red boxes that might talk about traditional uses of plants or animals, or those uses. You're going to see quotes and stories that have been gifted by elders to be shared in this guide. About, it might be something specific about a plant. It might be a practice along the lines of, harvesting in wetlands or the importance of wetlands. We worked really hard with different groups and resources to also include plant, animal, and place and traditional place names throughout the guide. So when you look at a picture in the guide, if we were able to source a place name, then we've also included that in the guide, along with the plant and animal names. And then we also were able to work with an artist and purchase some of her art. So that's from Darcy McDarmond, who's a Han and Shoshone artist, whose art and wetland plants are featured throughout the guide as well. Then lastly, as another step to integrate some of these like human values and wildlife values throughout the guide, we also have a species at risk and wildlife section in this guide. So rather than just saying, yes, this is a wetland, being able to connect why these wetlands are important for wildlife values and biodiversity but also wildlife uses are heavily connected with traditional knowledge. A lot of the quotes and things that we heard from elders were about how important wetlands are for wildlife and for their traditional uses in wetlands as well. So we also were able to do some sections identifying some important species that live and rely on wetlands. So yeah, these are really beautiful spreads. So if you get an opportunity, I would highly encourage you to go and take a look and learn more about the traditional values and Yukon First Nation values on wetlands that are throughout the guide, but also some of these wildlife values as well. So with that, that is my whirlwind quick overview of what is in the Yukon Wetland Field Guide. So I'm going to pass it back to Jamie to talk a little bit about what some of our goals are with the next steps and implementation of the field guide as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've started to do over the last couple summers and are hoping to do in the future is do a little bit of wetland training. So this would entail bringing a group of folks, do a little bit of classroom work, kind of go over some of the stuff Jessie presented in a little bit more detail, and then go out actually into the field with the guide and start practicing, trying to figure out, what type of wetland are those folks standing in. But I went out this summer with some people from Yukon government. And this is, the training, we can do it for pretty much, anybody, I think. I said I've worked with Yukon government. I've worked with a few Indigenous governments on this training. We're really hoping to reach out to industry in next year and in coming years to help get the people who are out, doing their work out on the land, whether it's mining or forestry or that type of thing, to just learn how to identify a wetland, know when they're in a wetland, so that they can work within the new wetland policy. So yeah, so just sort of a call out there if anybody on the call is interested in some wetland training, please reach out. And I guess I'd also say, we do this in other parts of Canada as well, particularly across the boreal forest. So don't be shy. Reach out if this is something that may be of interest to you, and we're happy to work with you to find something that will meet your needs. And I think with that, the next slide is just turning it over for questions in the Q&A. I see at least one has come in already, so encourage you to write any questions you have there. You can always get a hold of me or Jessie. Our contact information is there. And if you haven't done so already and are interested in getting a copy of the guide, you can see the QR code there will take you to the website to either download an electronic guide for free, or we do charge cost recovery on the printing fee for a hard copy. And I should note our financial support that we've received for this guide. Obviously, we had some internal funding, got some funding from the North American Wetlands Conservation Act to support this. The bulk of the funding was from Environment and Climate Change Canada through their habitat. Oh, I can't remember the name of the fund now. HSP is the acronym. And then Yukon government as well provided some funding to this, which was much appreciated. And I see, Carrie put the link in the Q&A as well. So with that, I guess we can start answering some of the question in the Q&A, Jessie.
Yeah, sounds good. I can read them out and then either I'll answer or defer to you maybe to answer some of them as well. So the first one has a comment and a question, and it says, I'm based in Wales, UK, and have traveled widely across the world in part to research wetlands, but I've never been to the Yukon or Canada. I would now like to go and love the guide, especially the incorporation of Indigenous perspectives and traditional ecological knowledge. My question is, are you able to make inroads into Canada's school education systems with these sorts of perspectives?
I don't think we've tried yet. Is probably the easy answer. I think that's a great idea. Like I said, the guide only came out in July. And this is the first, we've done guides in parts of Alberta before, but they've been aimed at a more technical audience. They're more of a technical document. This is the first one we've done where we've tried to broaden the scope and bring in that Indigenous knowledge and make it more of a aim it at that broader audience instead of just aiming it at people, consultants and people working for forestry companies, um, you know, broadening it out to such a wide audience. So I think that's something that it has been suggested before. We just don't necessarily know how to do that quite yet, but something that would be interesting to try. And I hope you're able to make it over to the Yukon soon, Stephen.
It's a pretty cool place. I actually live down in Alberta, so I got to go up and learn lots from Jamie and get to see the Yukon from doing this project. So would recommend going. But yeah, I think also through some of our educational programming beyond Ducks Unlimited, I think it's on the, or sorry, not beyond Ducks Unlimited, beyond the Boreal program within Ducks Unlimited. I think that there's definitely like it's like becoming more common to integrate more of these perspectives. But there's also being really careful about the way that we go about doing that work. So working with consultants like Copper and learning as staff how to respectfully engage and share this knowledge. In a way that, we had to go through processes with all the elders where they all had to approve the guide and what we put in the guide prior to even publishing it or printing it. So there's definitely, it takes time to build those relationships and get to those points too. The next question says, I'm based in Alberta and familiar with the local DU guide, so the Alberta Wetland Classification System Field Guide. Would the national presence of With the national presence of DU, would a comparison guide between provinces ever be on the horizon? So I'm assuming you're asking if like comparing the two classification systems or sorry, just a little bit of um, clarity there. I think in terms of comparing the two classification systems, unlikely. It's not something we've thought of at this point, at least. But Jamie, do you interpret that question a little bit differently?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because the Alberta government, they've created their own classification system. Yukon government is just in the process of finalizing theirs. So it's a bit more difficult to kind of be able to, you know, it's not quite apples to oranges, but there's a little bit of differences there. I will say, before we had the Yukon field guide, I used the Alberta guide. In the Yukon, it wasn't perfect. There was issues. Obviously some of the species in Alberta aren't in the Yukon. Some of the species in the Yukon that we find in wetlands aren't in wetlands. In Alberta, white spruce is a good example of that. They're pretty rare in Alberta wetlands, but relatively common in the Yukon. So I think that would kind of prevent some of it. I'm just also trying to think like what do you see as the value to having it, to be able to have a guide that compares the guides? That's the other thing,
Mhm.
is just trying. I mean, it's a bit of a cool academic exercise to do that comparison. I'm not sure it's necessarily a field guide at this stage, but yeah, if you have any ideas as to how that would benefit you or others, we'd love to hear that.
Definitely. Um, So the next question comes from our friend in the UK again that says, what are the implications of global warming and permafrost thaw for your classification system? Are you seeing a shift from, say, fen bogs to more marshes and shallow open waters?
So we're definitely seeing impacts in the Yukon. And I think it's so site specific what the impacts are going to be because it is going to depend on permafrost thaw, on or whether permafrost is even present. So yes, we do see thermokarsts occur where some open water will form as that ice melts out from underneath the wetland. We also see complete drainage and loss of wetlands, though, as well. So it'll actually go to potentially more of an upland system, at least in the short term. So there is a bit of a dynamicness to these wetlands in some places. There's been a lot of work up on Old Crow Flats, for example, over the last 15, 20 years, looking at wetland drainage due to they believe anyways climate change is playing a role in it. That's something that's happening maybe a little bit more often than it used to. So we're kind of seeing some wetlands get larger, some get smaller. We're seeing changes from one class to another, or we're seeing outright loss in some areas. Yeah, so a lot is happening. And this guide is more, it's that snapshot in time. I'm standing in the wetland. What do I see today? And am I in a bog or am I in a fen? Those types of things versus trying to understand all those impacts from climate change that we're seeing here in the north.
I'll leave it open for another moment or so if there's any other questions. But if not, then we are going to say it's safe to, oh, sorry, I started speaking too soon. Oh, that's just someone asking that a snapshot in time point is understood and a good way to look at it. Yeah, so with that, I think we'll wrap up our webinar for the day. If you're interested in downloading a version of the guide or purchasing a hard copy, you can follow the QR code on the screen or the link that was put into the chat. If you would like to talk more about the guide or anything related to Yukon wetlands, feel free to reach out to Jamie or myself, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you. But yes, thank you everyone for coming and watching our webinar today, and I hope that you all have a good rest of your days.